Institute's Democracy Week Constitution Day Lecture. I'm Tracy Potts. I'm the Executive Director of the Eisenhower Institute, and we are pleased to welcome Judge Christina Simpson here today as our speaker, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a moment. But first, I'd like to just briefly talk a bit about why we host this event. Constitution Day, and particularly the Constitution Day Lecture, part of our Democracy Week, pays tribute to President Dwight D. Eisenhower signing Proclamation 3151, which designated a week in September as Constitution Week. This is a time for contemplation and reflection on the historic acts that created our United States Constitution. Constitution Day and also Citizenship Day are recognized nationwide every year on September 17th. How many of you knew that? That's amazing, including all of the Eisenhower Institute staff in the back, and we're very happy to have them here with us as well. This day is recognized on September 17th every year to observe the signing of the U.S. Constitution in our state of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in 1787. And so that is why we are here tonight. This is really the highlight event of our Democracy Week, which has included community events, forums for some of our local races, and even a fun movie night at the end of the week. So we hope that some of you will come back for that. But tonight, importantly, I would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker. Judge Christina Simpson was elected to serve on the bench of Pennsylvania's 51st Judicial District in 2015, becoming the first and only female jurist in Adams County to date. Since taking the bench, Judge Simpson has presided over divorce, custody, support, and child dependency cases. She also serves as administrative judge overseeing the Adams County Domestic Relations Division. She established a therapy dog program and a conciliation program for child custody court. Currently, she's serving on the planning committee for the 2026 Children's Summit for Child Welfare Professionals, also assisting the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges to create a bench tool to educate Pennsylvania judges about the link between animal abuse and interpersonal violence. She is a native of Gettysburg. Judge Simpson earned her undergraduate degree from Mount St. Mary's College, her Juris Doctor degree from the Dickinson School of Law. Between 1997 and 2001, she was Assistant District Attorney for Adams County, specializing in prosecuting crimes involving domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. In recognition of her work, Judge Simpson received the Exceptional Woman in Public Service Award from the United Way of Adams County. In 2001, she joined the general law practice of Gates & Gates, PC, managing their Gettysburg office. In 2011, she established a solo practice in Gettysburg focused on collaborative solutions and family mediation. In private practice, she served the Adams County Court of Common Pleas as an arbitrator, a divorce hearing officer, guardian ad litem for children, and a parent coordinator, and devoted significant time to pro bono work in the community for clients and for a local domestic violence shelter. Clearly, she has spent a lot of time devoting herself and her skills to this community. Judge Simpson also served as adjunct professor of legal research and writing at Widener University School of Law between 2001 and 2002. She was an assistant solicitor for Adams County Children and Youth Services, has lectured on a variety of topics to the membership of the Pennsylvania Bar Institute, the Domestic Relations Association of Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania State Trial Judges Association. Tonight, her lecture will focus on the Constitution in everyday life, how courts shape families, communities, and justice. Please join me in welcoming Judge Simpson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That was such a warm welcome, and thank you all for being here. Typical college class, everybody's sitting in the back. That's okay, as long as you're comfortable. I hope everybody picked up your little handy-dandy pocket Constitution as you walked in. I actually have mine with me, but I like this one a little better, so I decided to take it as well. And it's important, I keep mine in my chambers all the time because it's important that we read this from time to time. We remember what it says. These words are really important. I really appreciate Gettysburg College and the Eisenhower Institute for inviting me to speak to you all today. As Tracy indicated, we're celebrating Constitution Day, which some people call it Citizenship Day. It's been called by different names over the years, and it's been celebrated for decades. And it's been 238 years since the Constitution was signed. Think about that, 238 years today that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, right here in Pennsylvania, as you said, signed our Constitution, and it still governs us to this day. Born from the experience of an overly powerful British monarchy and a weak central government under the Articles of Confederation, the framers designed a national government, as we all know, that assigned powers to 3 co-equal branches, while at the same time guaranteeing that the power of any branch could be checked by another. And that same model is used by our states, including here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Our courts protect all of our rights and freedoms by upholding the Constitution and ensuring that there is no overreach by any of the branches upon other branches of government. Courts strike down laws that are unconstitutional and those which infringe on our civil rights. The legislature checks the courts by rewriting laws that the courts have ruled as unconstitutional and to make those laws pass constitutional muster. Legislators can change the Constitution by passing amendments. The executive branch enforces the laws. As we know, on the state level, this would be the governor, the district attorney at the local level, the attorney general at the state level, Pennsylvania State Police in Pennsylvania, and other administrative officials. Our county commissioners, our mayors, our township supervisors in Pennsylvania, our district attorney are those members of the executive branch at our local level. Our local judicial branch engages with our county commissioners on daily or a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, but certainly on a regular basis, involving administrative matters such as funding for judicial programs, judicial facilities, personnel, and as well as facilities management. While we are separate and equal branches here in our local government, we also really have to come together and work together because we share facilities and we each have distinct needs. We need courtrooms, we need facilities for our folks coming to court, but the executive branch funds the judicial. And so that requires us to be in partnership, even though we are separate branches. And I will say in Adams County, we do a great job of that. We have, as a bench, have a great relationship with our county commissioners. And we don't always agree on everything, but we really, I think, have a wonderful civil discourse between all of us, and something that I'm very proud of as a citizen of this county. So tonight I'm here to talk to you about how the Constitution affects our daily lives. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about judicial independence, because that's something I feel very strongly about, as do my fellow jurists here in Pennsylvania, and probably nationally, I would venture to say. I want to give you some context for my remarks. I am speaking from my lens and my experience as a state trial court judge. I'm not a federal judge. I'm a judge here in the Court of Common Pleas in Adams County. The 51st Judicial District is comprised of the entirety of Adams County. So I sit here as a county judge employed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, elected as an elected official. As a state judge, I apply a variety of laws when making decisions. Federal and state constitution come into play. Statutes that are enacted by both the Pennsylvania legislature and the United States Congress. Federal, state, and local regulations and rules promulgated by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The principle of stare decisis is really our pole star. I spend a lot of time researching existing case law to determine how that might apply to a set of facts that I'm considering in a particular case. You might be interested in knowing that the number of judges in the Common Pleas Court in Pennsylvania depends on the population of the county. Here in Adams County, we have about 100,000 people. So it's a small rural area, as I'm sure you can observe. We only have 4 common pleas judges to handle all the things that we need to handle. We also have 4 magisterial district justices, which is the minor court below our level. Right now, we're operating with 3 judges because we have an open seat on our bench because one of our judges retired at the end of last year. And as I understand, there will be a forum here for those candidates on this campus in a couple of weeks. So I would invite you to attend that because I think that would be a really interesting event for you to witness because it doesn't happen very often. For me, specifically, I am assigned to mostly family court matters. That is something that I asked to be assigned to when I was elected because I had a lot of experience with that, and my fellow judge who was elected with me had been the district attorney, so he does a lot of criminal cases because that's his experience in his practice, and that's how we divided up our duties with the other judges, and it works very well. I'm in court on the bench pretty much every day, and we have one of our court staff here who can attest to that, and thank you for being here. I'm on the bench pretty much every day of the week. I spent all day in court today, so forgive me if my voice is a little hoarse because I did a lot of talking with some families, and I love doing that. I hear testimony, I make findings of fact, I make rulings, applying law, and I really enjoy doing that, although sometimes it is a little tiring, and my brain really has to be on all the time, but I really enjoy that challenge. I also spend time writing opinions and orders in my chambers, and when I have the time to do that as well. Some things I take under advisement, some things I rule from the bench, depending on the complexity of it. As was indicated, I handle divorce cases, child custody, child dependency, termination of parental rights, and adoption cases, and I oversee the domestic relations office, and that office deals with child and spousal support. So I am their administrative judge, and I help them run their day-to-day activities, and I oversee them. Many of the people you might be interested in knowing, we were discussing this a little earlier before we gathered here, many of the people that I encounter in court and a lot of our judges are self-represented. They do not have attorneys. And that's because in a civil case, you are not always entitled to have an attorney appointed for you. In criminal cases, you are. But in the cases that I deal with, some of them, you're not entitled to have an attorney appointed to you. So a lot of the folks that I see don't have a lawyer, and many of them are not well versed in what it's like to represent themselves in court. And that's very challenging for them, and it's challenging for me because I spend a lot of time trying to educate and say, well, this is what the procedure is, this is how we handle things, this is what the law is. And it's also, when we were talking earlier, Tracy said, it's usually the worst day of their life when they have to come into court, and that is so true. And we have to remember that. It might be the worst day of their life because they're getting a divorce, or they're fighting about their money, or dividing up their property, or who their child's going to spend time with and what that schedule's going to look like, and they feel like it's out of their hands and they're powerless. I think sometimes people feel that way. So we always have to keep that in mind when we have folks, especially the folks who don't have an advocate there representing them. We do have a limited, our legal services in Adams County has some ability to appoint an attorney in some child custody cases if a certain income threshold is met, and they have certain guidelines for that. And there are a lot of people who just can't afford a lawyer. They may have a job, they work very hard, they own their home, have a car, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have a lot of money to lay out for a retainer for a custody case, which can be protracted. So we always have to remember these things as judges. It's not like on TV where, people have lawyers and have advocates. It's really, really, you're seeing the people in your community who are having experiencing a problem and need help in resolving it. So it's very community-based in that respect, and it's really important, and we as judges in Pennsylvania have had a lot of training on having trauma-informed courtrooms, and we get a lot of training on trauma, so we come to that situation with hopefully an understanding of, yes, we have a job to do, but we have to meet people where they are and really, think that through and try to accommodate that. I want to talk to you also, because you might be interested, how are judges chosen? Well, at the federal level, they're appointed, and they're appointed for lifetime. In Pennsylvania, they're elected. We are elected, and it is a political process. So I invite you to think about, what are the pros and cons to being elected versus, or participating in an elected process and a political process versus an appointment process? There are pros and cons, I think, to each. I can only tell you my experience. In Pennsylvania, judicial candidates can cross-file. They can file on both the Republican and Democratic sides if they get enough signatures on their petitions. Some choose not to do that. There are various strategies that people have for that. So it's really strange because we have to participate in a political process, but once we're elected, that all goes out the window. We can't be political at all. So it's a very kind of a strange process. Common pleas court judges and appellate court judges, that's the judges of the Superior Court and the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, are elected to 10-year terms. And then after your first 10-year term, you are subject to a retention election, which means that there's a question on the ballot. There's no political party designation, but it's a question. Should this person be retained for another term in that court? So you answer yes or no, depending on how you feel about that. And in Pennsylvania, judges are required to retire when they turn 75 years of age, at the end of the calendar year in which they turn 75. On the federal bench, they're not required. They're appointed for life. But here in Pennsylvania, we have to retire the year that we turn 75. Now, we are allowed to serve as a senior judge until we're 78 years old on a part-time basis if we're needed. And you can be sent anywhere in the Commonwealth to handle cases if you are a senior judge. But those are part-time positions, and they're not guaranteed positions. So think about, again, the pros and cons of, is it better to have judges who are appointed for a lifetime? Is it better to have judges who have a mandatory retirement age? Again, I submit there are pros and cons perhaps to both. And should there be term limits on judges? There are no term limits for federal bench or for in the Commonwealth, although we have to retire when we're 75, so at least there's a cutoff point. So again, pros and cons to those approaches, something that we all should consider in the ongoing dialogue about what's best for our system. And think about how would the federal courts change if the president could just at will get rid of a judge, say, no, you're fired, we want to put somebody else in here. How would that affect the federal courts? Or if the governor of Pennsylvania said, Justice of the Supreme Court, we're going to let you go, and then there's going to be a new election for a new judge. How would that change things? How would that impact the continuity and stability of our court system and our decision-making process? Because it is a system, and it has a lot of moving parts, a lot of staff, a lot of support is needed. I have a staff, I have a wonderful assistant who helps me. I have a law clerk typically, that position is vacant right now, and occasionally I have an intern. I don't have a lot of support staff, but we also have a court administrator's office that helps us greatly with things that we need when we need interpreters, which we often need for people to have accommodations for their language and things of that nature. And as I said, in Pennsylvania, running for election to a judgeship is a political process, but even when we run for judge, we're limited in what we can talk about. We can't talk about how we might rule on a particular case. We can't endorse other political candidates. We have to be very careful not being in certain photographs with certain candidates for other offices, which might imply that we're endorsing them. We have to be very somewhat impartial, at least as much as possible. And there are very strict rules about campaign financing in Pennsylvania for judicial candidates. The candidate themselves cannot solicit donations to their candidacy. They need a committee for that. And once you're elected, you cannot participate in any partisan political activity whatsoever. You cannot endorse any candidate for any office, even for another judgeship. You cannot participate in any of that. And I want to talk to you about judicial independence. This is something that has been greatly on the minds of our Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I recently attended our state trial judges conference in Hershey this summer, and that was a topic of discussion. And I think, we are living in a very polarized atmosphere at this time, and the impartiality and fairness of our judiciary is critical in my viewpoint. The framers and the ratifiers of our Constitution realized this. They considered that a fair and impartial judiciary, one that follows the law and is not biased, partisan, intimidated, or seeking any kind of preferment, is central to our Republican form of government. The framers and the ratifiers believed that judicial independence is critical to fairness and impartiality. They thought of judicial independence in its two facets: the decisional independence of the judge from any outside pressures or inducements when deciding a case, and the independence of the judicial branch as a whole, as a separate branch of three. And again, why does this matter? Well, an independent judiciary is necessary to ensure the rule of law is respected. That's a hallmark of our civilized society. An independent judge will assure that your case will be decided according to the law and the facts, and not any kind of shifting or any kind of political climate. And that should be important to all of us, I submit. Judges must withstand the pressure of political and public opinion and make decisions that they believe are legally correct in accordance with statutory law and the federal and state constitutions. Once we are sworn in as judges, we must remain neutral and impartial. We must make our decisions solely based upon those facts as we determine them and applying them to legal precedent and statutes and constitutions. If a law is unconstitutional, no matter how popular it might be, we have to strike it down. Think about how dangerous it may be if judges decided cases based upon politics or popularity. In Pennsylvania, we actually have ethical canons that govern us that are also described in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And there are just really 4 of them that I want to highlight. The first one: a judge shall uphold and promote the independence, integrity, and impartiality of the judiciary, and shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. So what would be an example of appearance of impropriety? We were talking about this at dinner. I've had cases that came to me involving a former client. Well, I can't hear those cases because I already had a dog in that fight. I already was advocating for one side, so how could I possibly be impartial? That's a pretty obvious example, but that's an example that I've experienced. I was a lawyer before I became a judge, and I was a lawyer in this community for many years, so I have former clients in this community who may still have children subject to child custody cases and still maybe have disputes arising from time to time until their child is 18. So that's an example. If I go to the pub and have dinner with somebody who has maybe an attorney who has a case in my court tomorrow morning, how's that going to look if the other attorney on the other side comes in and sees me having dinner with that lawyer? That might be an appearance of impropriety. I think it is, and especially in a small community like ours. If I am at church with someone who has a case in my court, and I sit with them in church, even if I just sit next to them and we don't even converse, is that an appearance of impropriety? Well, it might be. So it's a little bit isolating, especially in a small community being a judge, but we accept that as part of our role. Secondly, a judge shall perform the duties of judicial office impartially, competently, and diligently. So when I think about that, I think about efficient resolution of a case, because people deserve a resolution. They deserve closure. They deserve a result. And the longer a case takes, think about it, the more frustration, the more angst that builds up. When is this going to get resolved? It really deeply affects people. So efficient resolution, I have to know what I'm doing. I have to be competent in what I'm knowing the law. I can't just depend on other people to tell me what I'm supposed to be doing. I have to know. The buck stops here. And in Pennsylvania, judges are required to obtain continuing education hours every year. So that's not the case in every state, I don't believe. And I'm not sure about the federal bench, but we are required, and we can only get those credits through certain avenues that are approved by our Supreme Court. So there's continuity and consistency in what we're being educated about. So that helps us to know, I'm getting some update on the, new family law, because family law changes a lot. I can get those updates at our educational sessions and be competent in what I'm doing, which is important to the people who come before me. Thirdly, a judge shall conduct a judge's personal and extrajudicial activities to minimize the risk of conflict with the obligations of judicial office. So again, a very obvious example, if I'm on the board of directors of the SPCA and I have a cruelty to animals case come before me if I'm doing criminal court, that's a conflict. I shouldn't be hearing that case. Again, my activities outside the courtroom, the associations I might affiliate myself with, and those sorts of things, I have to think about how that looks in certain situations, in certain cases, and does it create an appearance of impropriety? Again, that appearance of impropriety or an actual conflict. And that's a really important ethical consideration. Again, it makes it more isolating for us, especially in a small community. We can't be as perhaps involved in so many things because we are a small community and we hear a lot of cases and conflicts can arise. If we do have a conflict, we can recuse ourselves. So there's always a way out of that and have another judge assigned to the case. Sometimes all of us have to recuse ourselves. Our whole bench has to. And in that case, then our state administrative office of Pennsylvania courts will assign that case to a judge in a different county or a senior judge who floats around between different counties to specially handle that case, so there's no conflict of interest. And then I think there are similar procedures at the federal level and other states. Fourthly, a judge or candidate for judicial office shall not engage in political or campaign activity that is inconsistent with the independence, integrity, or impartiality of the judiciary. And we talked about this a little bit. We can't solicit money when we're running for judge, and we can't endorse political candidates. We can't, I can't put a sign in my yard. If my neighbor's running for township supervisor and I really like him and I think he's an awesome guy, I can't put a sign for him endorsing him in my yard. And I can't sign his petition. Not allowed to do those things because, again, it shows favoritism. And we can't do that. We have to be neutral. I think it's important to point out, too, that there are always people who will disagree with a judge's decision, right? And, of course, I've experienced that. As Americans, we should freely welcome reasoned disagreement by our fellow citizens, including disagreement with judicial decisions. As judges, we accept that we will be criticized for some of the decisions we make. And in a democracy, we know that everyone has that right and should have that right to criticize our decisions. We are not perfect. No one is perfect. But threatening a judge with retribution for not ruling in a certain way or threatening to strip the powers of the court is really beyond the pale. And that threatens the ability of our courts to perform their duties, our judges to perform their duties, and it's an attack on our very system of government. Judges are limited in their ability to respond to such criticism because of ethical rules. So if you ever wonder why isn't this judge responding to this criticism? Well, we're really not allowed to in most situations. And we're not allowed to talk about pending cases that are pending before us. We're not allowed to speak on those things. And we shouldn't. Because, again, we have to maintain impartiality and neutrality. Respect for the judicial system and the rule of law is essential to democracy. I think I've made that point. And I hearken back to, if any of you remember the Bush versus Gore decision back in 2000 when the presidential election was disputed. Our country was much less polarized then, granted. But I'm sure that Mr. Gore was not happy with when the Supreme Court said, sorry, but you lost the election and Mr. Bush won the election. I'm sure he was not happy about that. But he accepted it. And the country, more importantly, was able to move forward in an organized fashion and, proceed with the order of the day. And on a much more basic thought, how would the Super Bowl work if the loser of the Super Bowl refused to accept the outcome? Right? It's just silly. When I'm presiding over a case, I am not thinking about whether someone is of a political party, affiliated with a political party, or they supported a particular candidate. I don't even know that information because it's not relevant to what I'm deciding about, and I don't care about that. Most of the people I see are members of my own community. Most of them are decent people who are having family problems, who are having the toughest time in their life, and they need somebody to solve those problems or help them solve the problem. Now, I'm not talking about criminal court, where there are some people who are not such nice people, clearly, but I'm, again, speaking from my own perspective. And I see myself as a community peacemaker, or at least I hope that I am. My role is to see that procedural rules are followed by both sides without being influenced by public perception or my own personal views. I can't think about my own, well, this is how I would raise my child, or this is a decision I would make for my child. That doesn't matter. What matters is what the law says. And I'm going to talk about a parent's constitutional right to parent their child in a moment. Excuse me. I don't tolerate incivility in my courtroom. Carla will tell you that. I don't tolerate it because we all need to be able to be heard. I do a lot of talking, but I also do a lot of listening. And one of my pet peeves is when I'm talking or one of the parties or their lawyers is talking and the other side is talking to their lawyer and not listening, and we stop. Because we need to hear what each other is saying so that we can understand. And that is so important in a courtroom. Whether you're representing yourself or you have a lawyer, we need to be able to communicate, and that means we need to be able to listen and absorb and hear what each other is saying. Same with a jury trial. Think about it. If you're doing a civil jury trial or a criminal jury trial, how you as an attorney or you as a judge convey yourself to those folks who are not lawyers makes a difference. Being mindful of your audience. If I'm talking to an attorney, I may use different language. May use more terms of art. If I'm talking to someone who's not a lawyer, if I'm talking to members of a jury panel, then I'm not going to use a lot of those terms of art. I'm going to try to make sure that they understand it if they don't have that specific legal education. And I think that's really important as well as we try to communicate effectively in our courtrooms. Everyone in my courtroom is given an equal opportunity to speak as long as what they're saying is relevant to the matter at hand. And it's really important that we don't talk over each other, as I indicated. It's also important for my court reporter who's trying to type down what everybody's saying, and that's another pet peeve of mine when people don't speak one at a time because she can't do her job. I apply the facts to the law, make a decision. I do have a lot of discretion in my decisions, in what I do. And sometimes people don't agree with that and they file an appeal. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens. And that's okay. I accept that. I don't get upset about it because that's their right, and they have the right to disagree with the decision that I've made. And they have the right to have that reviewed by the Superior Court, which is an error-correcting court. And that court can say, hey, trial judge, you made a mistake, or you abused your discretion, and we're sending this case back down to you so you do the right thing, or you do what we think you should do. And I don't always agree with what the Superior Court thinks either, but I respect their decision, and I uphold their decision. And that's what makes this wonderful system work. How are we all affected by the work of the courts and the Constitution? So let's get to that. You may never set foot in a courtroom yourself, and that's probably a good thing, although you might be called to jury duty sometime, which I think is a really great opportunity to see how the court system works. I know some people think it's an inconvenience, and everybody's busy and has a life, but service as a juror is one of the, I think, a wonderful opportunity to really view from the inside out how a judicial system works. And we are very thankful for our jurors who serve on our panels. They provide a fundamental service, and we try to make it comfortable for them and as best we can, and accommodating for them, because they are doing a wonderful public service, a service that is required. I've never served as a juror. I actually, after I was sworn in as a judge, I got called for jury duty. So it's kind of bad timing. So I was not able to serve because I was a sitting judge, but I wish I would have had that experience before I became a judge, but I was never selected, so unfortunately, because I think it would be neat to see things from that perspective. Again, you may never go to court yourself, but you still benefit from an open and accessible court system on a daily basis at the state level, at the federal level. Our constitutions at the our U.S. Constitution, our state constitution affects us daily by establishing those fundamental rights and liberties, those freedoms that we all enjoy in this country. This harkens back to that principle in our Declaration of Independence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're all familiar with that language. And our constitutions provide a stable legal framework for our society so that we don't delve into chaos. Article 1, Section 11 of the Pennsylvania Constitution states, quote, "All courts shall be open, and every man for an injury done to him in his lands, goods, person, or reputation shall have remedy by due course of law, and right and justice administered, without sale, denial, or delay." So our constitutions, we have to be open. So how do you think that went during COVID? We were open. We were open for business. And I venture to say every court in this Commonwealth and our appellate courts were open for business. Our Supreme Court issued, because they are in charge of how our courts run in Pennsylvania, they issued emergency orders giving us some direction on what their expectations were of all of our districts in the state. And I know in our little county here with 4 judges, we made a plan that none of us, there would only be 1 judge in the courthouse at one time. Now, we actually have 2 court facilities. We have one here in town on Baltimore Street, and then we have another facility on Boyd School Road, which is our Human Services building, but we have a courtroom out there. And sometimes I sit in court in that building, and sometimes I sit in court in town. But we agreed that it would not be best for us to be in the courthouse together, until we figured out what was going on, because none of us really knew, what was happening with this virus. And there were times that we didn't really have a lot of technology at the time. We didn't have technology in all of our courtrooms to do Zoom, or we use WebEx, but you're probably more familiar with Zoom. So I remember sitting at my dining room table in my house with 2 cell phones. One had my assistant on speakerphone, and the other one was a conference call with the litigants, and I did court, and my court reporter was on with my assistant, and I did court from my dining room table, because we had people who still had emergency situations. They had emergency child custody situations. People still needed protection from abuse orders if they were being abused. Children were being abused and needed the Child Protective Services to be involved, and there are due process hearings that have to be held within a certain period of time. So we were open for business, and we made it work, and that's something that we are all very proud of, because our Constitution requires that. And you, as citizens, deserve the benefit of that. Our filing offices were open, accepting court papers and filings and deeds and lawsuits and responses to lawsuits and criminal charges that had to be filed and all sorts of things. And that's because our Constitution required it. The Supreme Court followed through on enforcing that and giving us guidance in how we dealt with that. And I don't know that that's the same result in every state, but I know in the Commonwealth we did a really great job of that, especially here in Adams County. And that was really because of our brilliant leadership, I feel. So again, how else are you affected by the work of the courts and the Constitution? Well, employers, if you have a job, your boss has to follow labor laws, right? If they violate labor laws, then they're violating your constitutional rights. As a driver, you have to obey traffic regulations. That's because we all, again, that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, we don't want people running stop signs and running into our car and causing damage or injury. A landlord cannot evict a tenant without cause and notice. That's the due process that I'll be talking about in a moment. But if you're a landlord and you have a tenant who hasn't paid their rent, you have a recourse to have that tenant removed as long as you follow the rules. So again, there's that balancing of liberty interests here. A grocery store can't sell you food that's outdated or unsafe. Businesses have to sell safe products, and manufacturers have to make safe products. If the court system lacked the capacity to regulate those things and enforce those laws regarding those behaviors, then our lives would be very different. Courts protect contractual and property rights of individuals and businesses. This affects our economy, our commerce, all of those sorts of things in daily life. And courts can enforce a contract or strike it down if the terms are ambiguous. The Due Process Clause of the United States Constitution 14th Amendment requires that people receive proper notice of claims against them, lawsuits, and an opportunity to be heard on those claims. That's so fundamental. So if someone files a lawsuit against you, they must properly serve you with notice of that lawsuit, and you are guaranteed an opportunity to answer that lawsuit and be heard about your position on that. I had to deal with that in court all afternoon because I had a lot of self-represented people who they don't always understand the service process of, okay, I filed my custody complaint about my child, but I didn't serve it on the other party. And there are specific rules about how you do that so that I, as a judge, can be sure that, okay, this person got notice of this lawsuit and they're not here. So I need to make sure they got notice, proper notice, under our rules of civil procedure so that then I can decide whether or not I can proceed. So I had to spend a lot of time talking to some people about serving, how do you do that, and continue the case, because that's the fair thing to do. The other side didn't have notice. So I can't proceed. That wouldn't be fair. They didn't have an opportunity to answer. And that, again, that's from the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment. And most of us know about the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. We see that on crime shows and movies and things like that. So we all have that right to not incriminate ourselves. And sometimes as a judge, I have to remind people of that. I had dependency court yesterday, and I had a couple of dads who were in jail on some criminal charges, and we were there dealing with their child and their children being in foster care setting or in placement. So we weren't there to talk about their criminal charges, but the fact that they're incarcerated impacts their ability to be available to parent their child. So I had to make sure before I spoke to them that I said, you have the right to remain silent about your criminal charges. You do not have to incriminate yourself. We're just going to talk about your child, because that's an important right that people, always need to be aware of. Sometimes a state constitution affords greater protection than the U.S. Constitution. In Pennsylvania, I'll give you an example, when the police perform a warrantless search of a motor vehicle, the Pennsylvania Constitution affords more privacy protections than the federal Constitution. In Pennsylvania, if there's a warrantless search of someone's vehicle, law enforcement must have probable cause, and there must be exigent circumstances. Under federal law, if you get pulled over on Park Service property on the battlefield by a park ranger, well, you're on federal land. They only need probable cause to search your vehicle. And there could be many things that comprise probable cause. But if you get pulled over here in the borough of Gettysburg, they need probable cause and exigent circumstances to perform a warrantless search of your vehicle. Otherwise, they need to go get a warrant from the magisterial district judge. So what's an exigent circumstance? Well, it could be a number of things. The law defines it as exigent circumstances arise where the need for prompt police action is imperative, either because evidence is likely to be destroyed or because there exists a threat of physical harm to police officers or other innocent individuals. How that is articulated may be a variety of facts. So the court, and sometimes we'll get motions in criminal court that say, well, we want this search. Let's say the police performed a warrantless search of a vehicle and found a gun. And that person is not supposed to have a gun because they have a prior conviction that prohibits them from having a weapon, a firearm. Well, their attorney might file a motion, an omnibus pretrial motion that says, we want that search tossed out because the officer didn't have exigent circumstances and should have gotten a warrant. So that's where the trial judge comes in, and we have to have an evidentiary hearing and figure out, well, what really happened here? What are the facts as to what happened here? And was that officer allowed to do that, or was it an unconstitutional search and seizure of that weapon? Child support. I don't know if, you've had experience with child support, or maybe parents have, or family members, but the Equal Protection Clause ensures that all children receive financial support regardless of their parents' circumstances. Children have that right under our Constitution. Federal laws provide incentives and enforcement mechanisms for child and spousal support, like wage garnishments and tax refund interceptions, to ensure these obligations are met. So as a state court judge, and I oversee the domestic relations office, I can order that your tax refund be seized by the domestic relations office, that money be taken and applied to your child support arrears. I can enter an order suspending your passport. You can't have your passport. Your passport is not valid until you pay your arrears on your child support, or until you take action that's satisfactory to me that you're making an effort to pay your child support. I can suspend your driver's license. I can take your hunting, fishing, and boating licenses, your recreational licenses for those of you who do those sorts of things. I can freeze your bank account. So I can take those things because it's for the benefit of your child. And with your driver's license, your passport, your recreational license, that's a coercive measure that the executive and the legislative branches have authorized courts to do, so as an incentive for you to pay your child support so you can get your driver's license back or your passport back. And I don't think a lot of people know that until it happens to them, and then they can't believe that that's happened to them. Well, take care of your kids, and that won't happen to you. It's something I feel very strongly about. taking care of your kids that you brought into this world and making, child support's a preeminent obligation. And I kind of take a firm stance on people supporting their children. As I mentioned, it's a fundamental constitutional right for parents to have care, custody, and control of their children, which is also rooted in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Fifth Amendment protects individuals from being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and that includes the liberty interest that parents have in raising their children. This liberty interest in the parent-child relationship includes the right of a parent to make decisions about their child's upbringing, religious affiliation, education, and care without unnecessary government interference. The state can only interfere in this relationship if there's a compelling reason, such as a threat to a child's welfare, if there's abuse or neglect of a child, and even then, the state, through the court, has to, the Child Protective Services Agency would be the state representative, and the court has to follow due process to ensure fairness and an opportunity to be heard. I do hear those cases quite a bit. I cannot take someone's child away from them without a due process hearing and an opportunity for the parents to be heard on that. We call that a shelter care hearing in Pennsylvania. And then we have an adjudication hearing after that. Child custody is a little different because that's a lawsuit where one parent is suing the other parent for custody of the child. Those laws are established at the state level, but they have to operate within constitutional standards. And in those cases, parents are voluntarily subjecting themselves to the authority of the court because they're filing a lawsuit. In those cases, the court is concerned with ensuring that a child has strong and healthy relationships with both parents and determining what is in the best interest of a child, which is challenging inquiry sometimes. And we have statutory factors that we have to consider. So there's continuity in those decisions. I thought it might be interesting to talk about freedom of speech, especially in family law cases, because that's a lot of what I deal with. As we know, the First Amendment precludes the government from restricting expression due to its message, ideas, subject matter, or content, but we know that this right is not absolute. The First Amendment protects a parent's right to speak to their children, but courts can restrict speech if it harms the child or is contrary to their best interests. I often tell my custody litigants, because they come in with all of their social media posts talking negatively about their co-parent, or look what she said about me, or look what he said about me on Facebook. And if the child's not able to see any of that, then that's really not an issue for me, except in the sense if it's a safety issue for a parent, if there are threats and things like that, then I certainly have to consider that. But if the child is, and I'm talking about Facebook, and I don't know how many people use Facebook anymore, but I'm a little older generation, but I know if the child, let's say the child who's at issue in the custody case is 16 and they're friends with mom and dad on Facebook and they're seeing all of those posts, those negative posts, then that's a problem. And I can restrict that speech. My thought that I share with custody litigants is that, yes, you have the right to freedom of speech and you have the right to say what you want to say. But how is that helping your child? That's what I ask them to think about. Just because you can say something doesn't mean you should. Or maybe you should take a breath and think about it before you post it. In my custody orders and in a lot of courts' custody orders, I have a non-disparagement clause where I order that the parents cannot say anything disparaging about the other parent in the presence or hearing of the child, and they cannot allow other people to do that in the presence or hearing of the child. And the compelling state interest there is the child's psychological well-being. And the child has a right to have, again, a healthy relationship with both parents. And sometimes I think parents forget about their child's rights. So that is a clause that I have in 99% of my custody orders. There was an interesting case in Pennsylvania that interpreted right to free speech. It was decided by our Superior Court fairly recently. The trial judge, it was not my case, but the trial judge had put some language in a custody order because there was a concern. Mom and dad were fighting over custody of a young child, and mom had gotten remarried, and the little child was calling the stepdad dad. Well, the biological dad was not having that. Said, I'm the dad. Nobody should be calling this guy dad. He shouldn't be calling this guy dad. I'm the dad. And we probably can understand why he would feel that way. And I believe the trial court put in language that restricted that we're not going to let this little child call the stepdad dad. Well, the Superior Court said, no, trial court, you are infringing on the child's right to freedom of speech. Because no one had demonstrated that the child calling the stepdad dad was causing emotional harm to the child or psychological harm to the child. So I thought that was an interesting case when it came out, because I had frankly put those provisions in some of my orders before, because I just thought, well, this is not right. That, I thought it was confusing it can be confusing for kids, but then you have some families who everybody gets along, so we might have, daddy so-and-so, and this is, the stepdad is also daddy so-and-so, and everybody's cool with it. So I think the Superior Court was correct on that decision, because we really do have to tailor that to a compelling state interest and tie that into, well, did anybody prove that this is psychologically damaging to the child? Well, if they haven't, then the child can call this other person whatever they want, because the child has a First Amendment right. And these content-based speech restrictions are subject to strict scrutiny and have to be narrowly tailored in that respect. So what about medical decisions for children? Well, both parents have, again, the constitutional right to parent the children as they see fit. That includes making medical decisions. So we encountered this sometimes. We've encountered it with the COVID vaccine when that was a real hot topic. We had parents, and I had some of those issues in my court where some parents said, no, I don't want my child getting this vaccine. And other parents said, yes, I want my child to be vaccinated. And so what happens when both parents don't agree? They both have equal rights if they have shared legal custody. Well, they have to come to court, and then I have to decide what we're going to do. And that's not a fun position to be in, because, what I think about vaccinations is irrelevant. What I do for my own child is completely irrelevant. It's about the parent's right to parent and care for their child in the way that they see fit. So then we have to have an evidentiary hearing, and I have to make a decision based upon the evidence, what I think is in the best interest of the child. So that usually involves bringing in the child's pediatrician and maybe some experts to testify back then about, the efficacy of the vaccine and things like that. So that was a very interesting hot button topic for a while. Freedom of religion. Again, in a custody case, both parents have equal say in religious upbringing if they have shared legal custody. So what happens when you have one parent who's Jewish and one parent who's Catholic? And when they lived together, everything was okay. They were married or lived together and we're an intact family, but now we're not anymore, and they disagree about religious upbringing. Again, they both have equal rights in that regard under the Constitution. So if they disagree about, well, should the child be going to CCD classes in the Catholic faith or going to temple, how do we resolve that? Well, I have to have an evidentiary hearing and decide that based on evidence. And typically, our appellate courts have ruled that, and again, I'm bound by what the courts above me have ruled, that during this parent's custodial time, they can expose the child to their spiritual or religious beliefs, and during the other parent's custodial time, they can expose the child to their spiritual or religious beliefs, and we're not going to talk negatively about each other's spiritual or religious beliefs. So that's really the only fair way that we can decide that, unless there was maybe a prior agreement that's proven that, well, we agreed we were going to bring this child up in a particular faith. And then I would hear further testimony about that. Like, well, why are you changing your mind about that now? Are there good reasons for that? Et cetera. But you can see even at this local level that we get some pretty complicated issues. What about grandparents' rights? Well, the Supreme Court has held that parents have, again, a right to control who their children associate with, and that includes grandparents. There is no constitutional right for third parties, such as grandparents or step-parents, to force visitation if a parent does not consent. Well, under Pennsylvania law, if the parents had previously consented to that relationship and then they separate, and then that third party, sometimes it's a step-parent, wants to be involved, then there may be a way in for them, but we have to have an evidentiary hearing about that. But typically, those instances where third parties are allowed to intervene are rare. Another way a grandparent can intervene if one of the parents is deceased, then the grandparents of the parent who are deceased have automatic standing to pursue a claim for partial physical custody. They cannot pursue a claim for legal custody, which means the decision-making for the child, that stays with the parent. But they can pursue a claim to see that child on a schedule, and then we have to have a trial and figure out, well, is this in the best interest of the child, for the child to maintain that relationship, and what would that schedule look like? Keeping in mind that the parent has really the upper hand in that situation, and the more powerful position, as they have the constitutional right to parent their children without interference from other parties, including grandparents. What about real estate? Eminent domain. We have the right to be secure in our homes, and we are not to be deprived of our property without due process and just compensation. So if the gas company wants to put a gas line across the farm that my parents own, and they aren't happy about that, well, then they have a right to be notified and heard on that issue. And if it's decided by the court that, well, it's in the public interest that the gas company or the utility company is allowed to put this gas line in, then my parents would be entitled to just compensation under the 5th and 14th Amendments of our Constitution. And one more thing about freedom of speech and saying things that we shouldn't say. In Pennsylvania, we have a crime called terroristic threats. So if you make a statement with intent to terrorize someone, or you make a statement that, involves, I'm going to do something to cause public disturbance or destruction, then obviously your speech can be curtailed and you can be punished for that speech, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. In Pennsylvania, we can restrict that. If you're convicted of certain crimes, then you would become ineligible to possess firearms, so that infringes on your right to possess firearms, but that's because you committed a crime. You can be, your firearms can be seized by order of the court if you have abused someone, if you've been found to have abused someone, or you are a threat to someone. Your firearms can be confiscated by the sheriff for a period of time in a protection from abuse action. So again, there are instances where our rights can be infringed upon because it is in the public interest. The last right I want to talk about is your right to vote, our right to vote. This is super important. We live in this fantastic country, and I know we have our problems, but we live in a country where we all have the right to vote, and some of us didn't always have that right. And when I look at voter turnout statistics, it's often disappointing when I see the voter turnout in some of the elections on the non-presidential election years. We always have high voter turnout in a presidential election. But I submit to you that our local officials, our local judges, our local county commissioners, school board members, township supervisors, those local officials are more likely to have a direct impact on your life than our national officials. So what I'm saying is it's really important to vote in every election. And not only just vote, but educate yourself on the candidates so you make an informed vote. And I know that takes time and effort, but it's a privilege to have the right to vote, a privilege that I think many people take for granted. I vote in every election. I try to do my research on the candidates and figure out who I think would be best suited for the job. I encourage my son to vote in every election, and I encourage all of you to do that. And we have, some local election coming up here, and some of you may not be residents here, and I understand that. So, where you vote, find out what's going on and when the election is. We have an election on November 4th, and look at the candidates, look at their experience. What do they bring to the table? Do those experiences or do their agendas align with, your points of view and your values? And please vote, because you don't really have a right to complain if you don't use your voice in the first place. If you don't participate, I don't think you have, you have a right to complain, but I think you should participate so you have more of a right to complain, is what I'm trying to say. I just feel really strongly about that. I was a political science major, so I guess that's why, one of the reasons. But I just think it's such an important, as a female in this country too, I think it's very important, because women didn't always have that right, and persons of color didn't always have that right, and that's why we need to exercise that right, I think. So I'm going to conclude, and I appreciate your patience with me. I hope you found this interesting. When I was preparing for tonight, I was looking at the Eisenhower Institute website and read your vision and mission and your value statements, and I was stricken by how the values of the Eisenhower Institute greatly align with the values and priorities of our judiciary as I see it. Democracy is one of those values, so I look at that as, from my perspective, fairness in the court system, treating people with fairness and equality, and fairness in how we apply the law, access to our courts, having your day in court, being able to talk to the judge and tell the judge what you want, or have your advocate do that for you. Facts, truth, and credibility, so important. We're inundated with social media. Now we have AI to worry about. Our Supreme Court just put out a policy statement about use of AI in the courts, and I need to digest that this week because I just received it. The truth, what is fact? Trial judges, we determine the facts. It's very important that we know what the truth is. Thirdly, respect. Having respect for all who come before us, having respect for each other. Our mission and vision statement in our court, and you can see it on our Adams County website, one of our statements is that we wish to treat all of those who come before us with respect and dignity, and also the people we work with respect and dignity. And I have that mission statement on my tagline on my email because I look at it every single day to remind myself this is what we are laser focused on, and always circling back to that. Diversity and inclusion, thinking about a jury of one's peers, a jury made up of one's community. Is that jury reflective of the defendant's community and inclusive of the defendant's community? Action. Making prompt decisions and resolving conflicts expeditiously so people can move on with their lives. And lastly, accountability. Holding people accountable for their actions, holding ourselves accountable for our own actions as well. And I would invite you, if you're interested, to review some videos on topics similar to what I talked about on a more national scale. There's a YouTube video called Why Read the Founding Documents. It's a discussion between a retired U.S. Supreme Court Justice Breyer and Justice Gorsuch. I watched it today, actually. It was after court. It was really, I thought, a good discussion, and those gentlemen are so passionate about our founding documents and what they mean to our country. And the Thomas Klein Center for Judicial Education at Duquesne University has a great video where the university president, Ken Gormley, interviewed Justice Breyer about judicial independence. We watched that video at our state trial judges conference this summer as part of a judicial independence class, and it is really a phenomenal discussion from the justice about judicial independence, and he speaks far more eloquently than I can on that topic, although I certainly did my best this evening. Lastly, democracy, the survival of democracy is not guaranteed. Think about that. It is not guaranteed. How are you, as our next generation, our upcoming leaders, going to uphold democratic principles and including judicial independence? And I hope that you'll be inspired by President Eisenhower's approach of engaging people with a variety of viewpoints and ideas to find common ground and take action, and that you will lead with honesty and integrity. As Justice Gorsuch stated, our system of government, this great experiment, as it has been called, which is born from the founding documents and some very brilliant people, in my opinion, is, quote, an incredible inheritance which has been given to us, end quote. And the torch is in your hands to decide how to carry that forward and to determine what you will leave for the generations to come. And I want to thank all of you for your hospitality, your attention this evening. I hope that you take something positive away from this talk, or you found maybe some of the things I talked about interesting, or you learned something. And I wish you all good health and success, and most importantly, peace. And I thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Tracy. I'll stick around for a little bit if anybody wants to talk to me. If you don't, that's okay, but I'll stick around for a little bit. So thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom with us this evening. As you were talking, I was thinking that our goal here this week has been to reveal what democracy looks like in our backyard. And I think you really walked us through and allowed us to see that. And I would be remiss if I didn't not only thank you for that, but also mention, as you said, it is our privilege to have not only the right to vote, but also the right to educate ourselves about how we vote. And so if you'd like to come back to this very room tomorrow night, you will have the opportunity to do that. The second of our candidate forums for those who will vote locally and those who live locally and want to know a little bit more about the decision makers here in the borough. We will have the school board candidates here tomorrow night, and also the judicial candidates, as you mentioned, on October 1st. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for your willingness to come and participate this evening. We hope you have a wonderful evening, and we hope you join us again. Thank you.